Okay, here we go. My computer is also struggling. So while I'm doing this, let me see if I can actually do this and talk at the same time. There we go. In order to give you my take on this, I have to back up a little bit. And one of the things I have to tell you is that I have my feeling about The Searchers. I think The Searchers is I don't know if I want to say a flawed masterpiece in its own way, but I think there's some interesting issues with The Searchers, which is considered by many critics to be the best Western ever made. One of them, to me, is that I have the feeling, as I watch this movie over and over again, that this is one of those situations that happen quite often, but masterpieces don't normally come out of this, where the different participants, I believe, may be making different movies. And what I mean by that is, I think and we can go back and we can look at interviews and we can kind of see this, we can hear this. I think the producer has a different idea about what this movie is than John Ford does. I think the writer has a slightly different idea of what this movie is than John Ford does. I think John Wayne definitely has a different idea of what this movie is than John Ford does. And I think we get some mixed signals in the movie because of that. In terms of Debbie's sort of sudden change, I think one of the things that's happening there is a societal attitude at play in which surely any reasonable person would understand that they'd be better off back with their white family than with their native captors. And that to some extent, Debbie's turn is sort of motivated to some extent, as you say, Camden, not earned, but motivated by external forces possibly. And that is the sort of attitudes of the society at the time. In terms of, still got things going here. In terms of what happens with John Wayne's character there at the end. Trying to get this PowerPoint up. Okay, hold on. Let me share with you just for a second. Okay. And I have my spinning ball, beach ball that I'm so fond of these days. When John Wayne's character, Ethan, first shows up at the house, and we're kind of introduced to him and all the sort of interesting and somewhat subtle dynamics that are going along there within the family. One of the things that he does is greets his niece. You guys can see the PowerPoint? Okay. Yeah. By picking her up into the air and smiling up at her, which is exactly what he does at the end when he has this sudden change of heart, when he's finally confronted with that moment in which he is either going to kill her or not kill her. His heart changes and he's unable to do it. And I think what Ford is saying to us by showing us this image that is a complete repetition of this earlier image is suggesting to us that Wayne's character, that Ethan has shed all of this hatred that he has developed over these years and years and years of searching. That's my take. That's not necessarily the only take. I'm going to put somebody on the spot here. because I happen to know that we have another participant here, an old friend of mine who's been teaching the searchers in his class as well, and he's sitting there going, "Uh-oh." Steve, do you have a take on this? This is Professor Steve Jarrett from Wake Forest University.
Sure. Yeah, I think the visual that you pointed out is part of what it's communicating is that by doing that same gesture of lifting her, that he flashes back to that moment, and suddenly what he's holding up is not this adult woman who has been corrupted by living with the Comanches, but this little girl. It's a lot harder to kill in cold blood a little girl than an adult woman, and I think there's that connection that flashes back. The other part of it, to me, is we get, and you guys haven't talked about it yet, but I think you will. We get all of these strong indications that there may have been some sort of relationship between Ethan and Martha. And so we cannot, the film does not insist on this reading, but we cannot dismiss, nor can Ethan dismiss, the possibility that this is his daughter.
Yeah.
And probably she's on some level maybe becomes aware of that too in that heavily charged emotional moment when he
and not necessarily even necessarily biological daughter, but that the relationship that is suggested that Ethan has with his sister-in-law leads to a stronger relationship with her children. So even if you don't buy into this idea, let me go back and share again for those of you that may have missed this. When these opening scenes, which I'm trying to remember, either the original screenplays do not have these opening scenes, or the novel perhaps does not have these opening scenes. But they're kind of constructed for this movie version of this particular story, which is based on a novel. There's a lot of heavy lifting going on in these opening scenes in terms of the relationships at play here. You can see the screen, guys? Thumbs up? Okay. You will notice that when Ethan first arrives, his sister-in-law, there are a lot of longing sort of glances between the two of them. There's this moment that Ford lingers on where she takes his coat into the back bedroom and she sort of caresses it very lovingly, and he's looking at her while she's doing that. And the brother seems to be sort of out of the loop, but not recognizing what's going on. There's also this moment when they're getting ready to go out on their first raid, where Ethan's old friend, the minister, the head of the Texas Rangers, has this sort of, you can see down here in the bottom left, has this sort of, he's consciously ignoring that Ethan and his sister-in-law are sort of having this moment before they leave. So although it is not in dialogue in any way, there are images and performances that really do suggest this strong relationship. It also suggests that when Ethan and Paulie go out on their mission, that Ethan's motivations may be slightly different than Paulie's, that it's not necessarily just a rescue mission for Ethan, that it is a mission of vengeance, because it's, to me, pretty obvious the woman he loves has been massacred, probably raped, certainly that is strongly suggested, butchered, so that it may be that Ethan doesn't even start off with this motivation of rescuing Debbie as much as he has this motivation of vengeance. So those are a couple of things that are going on there. I'm not saying they necessarily earn the ending that we have, but I think they do to some extent begin to maybe possibly explain, because by the same token that if Ethan is having a flashback when he lifts her up into the air, Debbie may be returning to who she was before she was captured as well. Now, this, of course, it is all hinging on this idea that is inherent in many Westerns, this idea of civilization versus the wilderness, the inside of all of these places versus the exterior, right? The civilization is kind of is inside, and it is the wilderness and the threat and the savagery that's coming from the outside. Therefore, we have all of these, and then the movie bookended with images of people coming out and going through doors. The other thing I want to mention about this before I forget about it, to back up just a little bit and understand, look, we've got 50 plus years in which both motion pictures and television, and the Western was a huge popular genre on television in the first decade, 2 decades of television, in which if you were an American and you went to the movies, probably your only exposure to a Native American would be the images that you see in these motion pictures. We're talking about a race that at this point in time, and to a large extent still today, relegated to certain pieces of property, the reservation as it's referred to, that have, at this period of time, very little interaction with the rest of society, completely relegated to sort of not only second-class citizen status, but not even citizen status. To what extent, and this is not a question we can answer, but we do have to question, to what extent has our ability as a society and a culture to basically relegate this population to second, third, fourth, fifth class citizenship, where they still are, where they still live. To what extent are we able to do that as a society because movies show us this version of Native Americans, and to a large extent no other, for 50 to 60 years? What I was saying before I got cut off, I was just watching a documentary, which I strongly recommend. It's on Amazon. No, actually, it's running on, I think, Stars right now, called "This Changes Everything," which is about the struggle of, largely about the struggle of female filmmakers to sort of make it in this industry, and the way in which the portrayal of women on the screen may very well have led to, again, our society's ability to sort of subjugate what is over 50% of our population. Our movies have a tendency to emphasize men way over women. The statistics are really staggering. We'll get into this a little more later in the semester, but the statistics of how much screen time female protagonists have versus male protagonists, how much dialogue female characters have versus male characters. I mean, everything is incredible. We're talking about 70, 80% male in all of these categories. So, what this documentary is questioning is what I'm asking about Native Americans, and that is that, to what extent are we able to, allow wage inequity and glass ceilings and all that stuff, because we're constantly inundated by movies in which men are more important than women. Now, one of the things that happens, and I really encourage you to go into the PowerPoint and look at the few clips I have from a documentary called Reel, R-E-E-L, Engine, which is a documentary by a Native American filmmaker about the way in which Native Americans are portrayed in movies. And one of the things we discover, and going back to what Austin originally said, all of these sort of decorative elements that we see, the sort of stereotyped costuming of Native Americans, is largely all made up. the whole idea that we see Native Americans often wearing headbands is not because Native Americans wore headbands. It's because Native Americans were portrayed by white guys, by stuntmen, and they were wearing wigs, and they had to come up with something to keep the wigs on. And that became a total staple of how we image them. The feathers are something that's only done by the Plains Indians. But by applying that to everyone, what one person in this documentary has said that I think is very telling is, let me get to it. It's in here somewhere. Okay, here we go. Okay. What basically movies have taken is an incredibly rich and diverse culture in which there are numerous nations of peoples, and they have taken all of them and homogenized them into one. So we don't look at movies and think, well, that's Comanche, that's Iroquois, that's, or all of these different tribes and races and nations. We just think they're Indians. And one of the things that Jesse Wendt says in this Real Engine documentary is, while probably not calculated, it's an ingenious act of colonialism. You're essentially robbing nations of an identity and grouping them all into one. That's just one of the many sort of impacts that the depiction of Native Americans in these movies have had. He also says of Stagecoach that Stagecoach is the iconic Western that all others were really modeled after, and it's one of the most damaging movies for Native people in history. You have white society inside the stagecoach, and they are besieged on all sides by Native people, by the wild of America. And one of the issues here is that Stagecoach for the Western genre basically acts as a template. So the history here is that we had a lot of popular Westerns during the silent era. We get into the sound era. The motion picture industry consolidates. The motion picture industry during the sound era has these enormous costs of converting to sound. That brings in the banks in terms of investing in the motion picture industry. That consolidates the industry. That has a lot of effects in it. In the silent era, there were lots of women working in very important roles. And suddenly when it becomes a big business run by banks, women no longer have these important roles in the motion picture industry. At this time, going into sound, Westerns were kind of relegated to a ghetto. All the Westerns from the 1930s, practically all of them, up until 1939, are what are referred to as B-Westerns. They're these things that were made, they were shot in a week, they were barely an hour long. They had all of these different Western stars. They were shown on Saturdays in movie theaters. So predominantly the little boys had something fun to go watch. They were incredibly simplistic. This is where we get the white hats and the black hats, the good guys and the bad guys, broad sort of comedy, comic relief. And it is not until 1939 that in this weird sort of instance, I think, of synchronicity, that most of the major studios suddenly go, hey, let's make a big budget Western. Let's make an A Western. The first of which is Stagecoach. And Stagecoach, being this incredibly popular Western, made for all audiences, with a budget, with actors, with characterization, with interesting camera work, with a budget, if nothing else, with these amazing locations that people had never seen in movies before. sets the template. This is what a Western going forward is going to be. So when John Ford basically presents Native Americans, in this instance, in Stagecoach, as something akin to a natural phenomenon, they have no more personality than we would. Stagecoach is largely a disaster movie. And disaster movies are all about getting a group of characters together, and now suddenly there's a flood, there's a meteor, there's a tower on fire, there's a cruise ship turning upside down. In this case, they're Native Americans. And the Native Americans are treated kind of like just a force of nature. There's no personality, there's no character, there's no real motivation. Now, this is different in The Searchers. So there's my soapbox issue there. Let me throw it open to you guys, maybe some more on that, or take us in a different direction dealing with Stagecoach or The Searchers. We seem to be on The Searchers now.
Yeah, I was going to say, because you mentioned it in your slide about the sort of connection that people make to samurai films like Akira Kurosawa, and how you were talking about the pop culture and how it affects people. And in the slides, you talk about that, like, kind of how violence is portrayed in the Westerns, and that in the United States, we don't have this concept of going from a colonial power to being humbled and being defeated, whereas in Japan, they went from being a colonial power to being defeated, and how that kind of affected Akira Kurosawa, and how we kind of just have this unbridled kind of go west and conquer attitude. And I think a really great example that reflects that is, so in The Searchers, there's this scene where, there's this joke about the sword, the cavalryman's sword, the lieutenant's sword. And then we later see, after they slaughter the Comanches, that, like, he's been stabbed or slashed in the butt.
Yeah.
And that's a joke. Well, in Seven Samurai, there's actually a scene where it's a shot, really, where one of the characters that actually chases another soldier down and then impales him in the ass with a spear and kills him. And so that's kind of like, to me, the two contrasts between is that in the Akira Kurosawa film, the violence is very brutal and ugly and just kind of gritty. Whereas in this, it just seems more like an adventure, and more exciting, more of a fun and kind of thing. And that's kind of like the difference between the two.
Well, it's one of the things that is an unintended consequence of the production code, which does, control the extent to what kind of violence can be shown and how it can be depicted. That by you basically water down violence in American films of this era. So we see as the production code begins to wane going through this decade and finally falling apart by the end of the 1960s, that the violence becomes more realistic. Well, maybe realistic is too strong a word, but certainly becomes more brutal. So, one of the unintended consequences is, this perception of violence as something that's exciting, something that's, and we still have that to this day, rather than something that is sort of brutal and damaging and, the way in which bodies are destroyed. It amazes me to watch fist fights in movies. I love a good fist fight in a movie, but once someone lands one good punch with their bare fist on your head, you are, it's not going to be necessarily that long of a fight. These are incredibly damaging circumstances. The other thing about the samurai too is, with the samurai film and the American film, we've got societies that are both looking back at a time with a certain level of nostalgia, not necessarily, as if there was nothing wrong during that time or everything was rosy during that time, but a certain nostalgia for a time in which a man was a man, right? The rugged individualist, which we have in the Western, and we have in John Wayne's, in both of these films. And I had another thought. The other thing about samurai films that everyone should be aware of, and I think Braden probably already knows this, is that there's been sort of a cross-pollination between samurai films and Westerns in the whole history of post-war cinema. So that the Seven Samurai, which I cannot recommend enough, it's on Canopy, The Seven Samurai, which is considered to be one of the great sort of samurai films, not only has a lot of the same tropes that we associate with Westerns, but actually is directly remade as a Western called The Magnificent Seven, which is then again remade just a few years ago as another version of The Magnificent Seven. Many of Akira Kurosawa's samurai films are remade as Westerns. So Sanjuro and Yojimbo are both remade as spaghetti Westerns. Westerns made in Italy in the 1960s, starring Clint Eastwood. In something that's sort of a reverse, it's very difficult to find, but there's a samurai version of Unforgiven, the Clint Eastwood, Morgan Freeman, Gene Hackman film from the 1990s or 1990s. So there have always been these comparisons between these two. And a lot of this has to do with the rugged individualist, and it has to do with the fact that this idea of a cowboy, a Western, a gunfighter, having a code. And, in The Searchers, I think John Ford is questioning that code. But that code is codified in samurai mythology. They have this code. This code is written down. This code is very specific. And these roaming, these ronin, these unconnected samurai who are not connected to a master, sort of wandering Japan, is very, very similar to the idea of the lone gunfighter, roaming the West, operating under a particular code. There's a wonderful, I won't pull the slide up, but I'll look at it real quick. There's a wonderful quote from what is John Wayne's last film. It's a movie called The Shootist. It's a really interesting movie in that, let me share this. In that, where are you? At the time it was made, John Wayne was in fact dying of cancer. He plays a character, an aging gunfighter who is also dying of cancer, and who is, through the course of the film, kind of arranging his own death so that he can go out in a blaze of glory, but not be, not sort of die this horrible, painful death that the cancer is going to create. And in this last movie of John Wayne's, here we go, he has this quote that I think is just particularly apt for sort of codifying this idea. He says to a character played by Ron Howard, "I won't be wronged, I won't be insulted, I won't be laid a hand on, I don't do these things to other people, and I require the same of them." Which I think, in a movie that is his last film, a movie in which the character is dying and the actor is dying, is kind of a summary of the characters that he has been playing since the silent era. John Wayne started off as a silent actor. Then he was in a lot of these B westerns in the 30s that we talked about, and he became a big star based on John Ford kind of pulling him out of these B westerns and putting him in Stagecoach. So, okay. What else, guys? Searchers, Native Americans.
Professor Bone.
Yeah, Dylan.
I really like the difference between, we talked about this a little bit earlier, Stagecoach and The Searchers, because when you look at Stagecoach, to me, he really is that codified gunslinger, the really good guy who just, like we talked about it, he's going after people that have wronged him and people that he cares about. But then you get to The Searchers, and even though that he's been wronged, he has some very flawed ways of going about it. And I find that makes it a better film. Like, yes, your family's gone. Yes, you're worried about your nieces, but he also takes very violent approaches, very, like when he desecrates the corpse,
Yeah.
As far as like it getting to the afterlife. I think that makes it a more interesting film, because the person that attempts to hold on to the code yet struggles very heavily, it's a lot more entertaining to watch. It's a lot easier to, empathize with them versus this person that does no wrong. We know he's going to get the girl. We know he's going to meet the requirements at the end. We know he's going to be this mythic cowboy. So I think out of the two, I prefer the Searchers.
Okay.
Now, so.
And you know, one of the I didn't used to show both of these. I used to just show the Searchers, and I really do like the idea of comparing these. I think, you know, seeing the development of an actor like, you know, a massive movie star like John Wayne, a director like John Ford, a genre like the Western. So one of the things that, you know, if we broadened out and we looked at more Westerns and more John Ford, one of the things we notice is that if we go back into the B Westerns of the 1930s, we have less characterization, less complexity, less nuance than we have in Stagecoach, where John Wayne is in fact portraying a criminal. I mean, he's a criminal with a code, and we like him, and he's to some extent he's unquestionably the hero of the movie, but there's a little bit of a dark side to him. That development from there to what we see him play in The Searchers, which is a much more complex, much less likable, you know, this man driven by nothing but hatred and racism, introduced in the movie, you know, very suspiciously. He's got money. He's coming from the Mexican War. He's probably been some kind of soldier of fortune. You know, there's all this mystery surrounding him. There's that. We have the Native Americans who are basically a force of nature in Stagecoach, but by the time we get to the Searchers, they have character, they have motivation. To some extent, there is the mirroring, the sort of doppelgangering of Ethan and Scar. They're very actually similar characters, and they have similar motivations. If we keep going forward with John Ford, we will see that one of his last films is dealing with the Trail of Tears, where the Native Americans were marched across the country to their reservations, and hundreds of thousands died in these forced marches. And that movie is all about sort of, you know, to the extent it can be in the 1960s, is all about, you know, the plight of the Native Americans and how we've treated Native Americans. The Native Americans are the main characters of that particular movie. So we can see a development of the way society is starting to recognize a more complex issue. We can see the way a filmmaker is developing an aspect of a more, you know, is getting more into the details and the complications of this particular issue. And I think, you know, watching that kind of that transition, I think is something that's really, it's really kind of interesting to see and important. So theoretically, you would want to think that The Searchers is a better movie than Stagecoach. You would want to think that as artists develop and they get more in tune with societal injustice and with their own technique and with the stories that they tell, that it would get better. There's still a lot of people that like Stagecoach a lot better, and you know, to some extent it's certainly a more evenly toned movie. The tone in The Searchers is something that a lot of people have struggled with, you know, these sudden bits of slapstick comedy that are thrown in, not atypical of John Ford, a little more extreme in this particular movie. I suspect that the story of the movie, the novel The Searchers has no comedy. I mean, not even a moment of comedy. It is just a dark, brutal book. I think John Ford, his writer, his producer, I think they were all a little concerned that this movie would be too dark for audiences. And I think they've thrown in a lot of this sort of quote unquote either comedy relief or character comedy in order to kind of break up, you know, the sort of oppressive darkness of the movie and the characters and the mission and everything else. The other thing that I've asked you guys to read, and it's on D2L, is an article titled "Native American, I think, Responses to the Searchers." I can't remember, it's been quite a few years, but a group of Native Americans got together and they watched The Searchers, and this is about their reaction to the movie. But to me, the most important thing that they say and the most interesting thing that they say is that The Searchers is a different movie if you start it sooner. So this movie essentially starts with some exposition where we establish the characters, and then we're seeing everything from the white people's perspective. We don't even see Native Americans for quite some time. They're attacking, and then they brutally massacre and murder this family we've come to kind of sympathize with, empathize with, maybe even like. They are doing that because their lands have been invaded, because the U.S. cavalry has been slaughtering their people. If we start the movie with the U.S. cavalry coming in and slaughtering Scar's family, and then we see Scar go on the rampage, it's a different movie. You know, Orson Welles once said, I get this backwards a little bit, but I think he said, all movies have happy endings if you all stories have happy endings if you stop them at the right place. And all stories have unhappy endings if you stop them at the specific place. And the Native Americans are basically saying, even imagine if our story here starts with the raid that happens about 2/3 of the way into the movie, in which the cavalry comes in and just butchers everyone. And even Ethan looks at that situation and goes, maybe this is a little too much for me. But just goes in and butchers women, children, everyone, right? If it starts with that, are our sympathies then going to be more with Scar than they are with Ethan? And it just has a matter of perspective. Are we telling the story, the white person's story, or are we telling the Native American story? So it's really interesting. I really recommend, in fact, I'm requiring, but I really recommend that you read that article. It's really very interesting. What else about The Searchers, guys?
People were talking about like the abruptness of the ending, and you were kind of commenting on it a little bit. It kind of answered my question, because I was wondering when I watched this, like how much this genre grew out of TV, because a lot of this movie felt very TV-ish to me in the terms of like the melodrama of it, like these kind of really abrupt tonal shifts.
Yeah.
Like a great example, like in the music too. Like a great example is like Brad. Brad runs off and he dies, avenging his fiance's death, and and then the very next shot is like this very serene. It just switches really to the serene, very bright, serene music with violins, and then there's Brad's empty horse, and they don't really, there's no really like you don't really feel the emotional impact of Brad's death. It just kind of like, well, Brad's gone, and then they just kind of move on. And there's a lot of that I felt like in this movie. Kind of.
It's interesting, and I'm sorry. Go ahead. I know some of you have probably seen Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which deals to a little bit with the westerns being produced for television. It in fact even deals with one of the which I think is great. The Manson family sort of took refuge at one of these old movie ranches that are all around the only on one side, the outskirts of Los Angeles, that would host Western movies. So a lot of stagecoach that's not taking place in Monument Valley is actually taking place on one of these movie ranches, and you see one of those sort of decrepit movie ranches in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And I just took that side event, and now I've forgotten what I was. What were we talking? What was your comment? Was
it wasn't just like the ending that felt like it was abrupt. It was just a lot of tonal shifts, abrupt sort of switches, even from like darkness to comedy, from darkness to like upbeatness. In the music and everything. It just kind of made these shifts that felt very TV to me, like a Leave It to Beaver almost.
And I can see that. The TV westerns of that period were sort of the natural outgrowth of the B westerns of the 1930s. And you do see a lot of this very heavy-handed comedy sort of thrust into these B westerns of the 1930s. It fits in a little better, I think, in those movies, because those movies are not attempting to deal with realistic, emotions. They're not attempting to deal with complexity and nuance. It's all just fist fights and horse chases and bad guys and good guys. I will say that, the thing that throws me, look, if I'm going to sit down and watch The Searchers now after having seen it like 100 times, there are lots of things I'm probably going to fast forward through, and they're all going to be comedy, right? And there's some comedy in this, in the film that I think is actually very damaging. I think the whole subplot about look is the single most racist and to some extent, a large extent, sexist thing that occurs in the movie. That, you know, a Native American woman falling in love with a guy and accidentally being married to him and then being treated the way she is treated. I mean, kicked and, you know, just brutally treated for comedy, is something that certainly doesn't really work very well for me. And it's one of those reasons why, you know, I think you're sensing the same thing I'm sensing. This feels like a couple of different movies. If you take it piece by piece, there's nothing we see, or very little we see in these comedy bits that we haven't seen in John Ford films before, or we'll see in John Ford films later. We very seldom see it in John Ford films sort of butted up against this level of darkness. So I certainly sympathize. And by the way, if you think the ending of this movie is abrupt, wait till you get to Vertigo. Which some people feel like the last reel of the movie is just missing.
That is the most disappointing ending I've seen in forever.
Well, we'll get to that. I will be defending it, but, you know, I usually defend just about everything. What else about The Searchers, guys?
Well, I was going to add that I actually like Stagecoach more, even though it does have a more kind of crudely made feel to it, since Ford obviously hadn't honed his craft as well as he did in The Searchers. On a technical level, The Searchers is quite better, I think.
Okay.
But I just think the story does feel a bit more smooth in Stagecoach. I like the characters a lot more. I think the characterization of many of the characters is a lot more believable. And I also liked John Wayne's character a bit more in Stagecoach. I thought his dynamic with Dallas was more interesting than his dynamic with whatever his name was in The Searchers. I forget what his name was.
What
was his name?
You mean with his partner, with
half Indian guy?
Yeah. I just said it earlier.
Martin was. Yeah. Because in The Searchers, I felt like there was a lot of missed opportunities with Martin and Ethan to connect a little bit more. I never felt like I had a sense of where they stood with each other, other than they kind of hated each other the whole time.
Well, let me ask you that question. What do you think the dramatic function of Martin's character is in The Searchers? Why is he even there?
Yeah, well, I see him as kind of a different perspective on the Indian culture, considering he is a quarter. Isn't he a quarter Cherokee?
I think that's right.
So he obviously has a deeper connection and sympathy for the Indian people, along with he also seems to have a bit more of a sympathy toward Debbie when she does realize that she wants to be part of that culture, because in some ways he is part of that culture as well, and he feels just as victimized as she might have been. And so his dynamic between him and her kind of coincide in a certain way.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I didn't think that they handled Martin's character very well. I didn't think he acted very well. I thought he was very kind of hammy and just very unrealistic, in my opinion. I didn't believe how angry and just over the top he was. And I just didn't get a sense of him and Ethan's dynamic with each other. I just didn't know where they stood with each other, and they were either fighting each other or separated. There wasn't a campfire moment where they sit around and have a heart-to-heart or some kind of middle ground of some sort.
I will give you my take on this. Again, I'm not trying to either attack or defend anything. I just think everything's interesting just to think about. So in lots of situations, I know lots of you want to be writers. In some situations, multiple characters are written and created and devised in order to, in some sort of way, represent the different layers of one character. There's a wonderful example of this in a movie that, if you haven't seen it, I can't recommend it highly enough, called Raising Arizona, in which the Nicolas Cage character and the villain character, the biker character, there are all sorts of hints in this movie that they're basically the same person. And what they do is kind of, in a dramatic way, represent different aspects of a person. I think that the reason that Martin is there and the reason that Ethan and Martin are together, is to kind of take what might be all of the conflicting attitudes in a character like Ethan and personify them in another person. So, if we're reading a novel, right, we can be inside of a character's head. We can literally be hearing their thoughts. And we can do that to a certain extent in movies too, but it can be a little fun. If we take a character like Martin and we let him represent either the contrary aspects of Ethan's character or just an opposite of Ethan, we have the ability then to have these sort of conversations, these confrontations that might normally be internal, and now they are externalized. I think because of that, it might work from a dramatic standpoint, but perhaps not from a rhetorical standpoint for them to kind of have the moment that you're seeking, where they get along, because they are always at odds with each other in the same way that there are forces inside Ethan that are fighting. This is my kind of take on it. Not necessarily the only take, and I can't argue that it's necessarily done perfectly, and in some cases maybe even done well. But let me ask you guys a question. Okay, why? We all have problems with The Searchers, right? I mean, I still love the movie. We all have some problems with it. We've got some issues with it. Why does everyone in the critical community seem to think that The Searchers is the greatest American Western ever made? Can we back up and try to figure out why that is? Not in the 1950s, but even today. The American Film Institute, I believe, in their list puts The Searchers first. I might be wrong about that. I've got it up here somewhere. I'm going to check it real quick.
Something that I noticed about the most popular movies in
it's number
general
one
is
on
that
the American Film Institute list. Yeah, go ahead.
something I noticed about the most popular movies is that they all seem to have like a sort of similar plot structure that The Searchers has, where something happens leading to people getting captured, and then like a couple people go out to save them. I mean, Star Wars, for example, has that basic plot.
Well, yeah, and
But
Star Wars has all sorts of, there's the scene in Star Wars, just to step aside, the scene in Star Wars where Luke comes back and discovers that his aunt and uncle have been murdered, and it's a direct copy, a direct reference to the same scene in The Searchers.
yeah, I was actually going to bring that up earlier, but something I noticed is that like another parallel between Star Wars and The Searchers is that halfway through, hold on, I might not have thought this entirely through, but
That's okay.
hold on.
We will tell you you're wrong very quickly if we need.
There's like a sort of when the typical save the damsel in distress plot appears to come to a close, suddenly there's this plot twist that it's like, no, I don't want to leave. I've assimilated myself. I much appreciate this culture far better than what I had before. And that sort of added an extra sense of drama.
And there is a similar moment in Star Wars, and what the moment in Star Wars is I don't need to be rescued. I'm more adept at this stuff than you are. You guys are kind of bumbling idiots. Why are you even trying to help me? That's a similar kind of turn to I don't want to be rescued. Yeah, so I see that similarity.
Yeah, and on top of that, like in the Searchers, like it's like not only do I not want to be rescued, I'd much rather live in this sort of community. On top of that, the added context of Scar actually getting revenge for, I believe it was his kids who were slaughtered, that added an extra sense of drama.
Yeah.
So, and that helps us sympathize with Scar. So having that extra layer might help the movie feel better in a sense.
Yeah.
Because it humanizes the antagonist, which is something that a lot of other westerns, such as Stagecoach, don't
Not
entirely
done
do.
yet. Yeah, and which as would increase. We'll eventually get to Dances with Wolves, which has its own problems, but is complete. In which the Native American characters are very fleshed out and completely sympathetic. The unfortunate part of that is we still seem to have that story told to us from the perspective of a white man, and when the white man falls in love with somebody, it has to be a white woman, and there are problems there. But I also want to mention, this whole idea of the rescue narrative, which you're noticing, which a huge part of our popular culture, exists around this idea of the rescue narrative. And almost always the idea that there's a damsel in distress who's going to be rescued by our main protagonist, and that his reward for the rescue will be the damsel. I want to bring this up because certainly that plays into The Searchers, but boy howdy, did I just say that? Does it play into Vertigo? So if you haven't watched Vertigo yet, or if you're going to watch Vertigo, or you're thinking about Vertigo, think about the way in which this whole idea of the damsel in distress rescue narrative, the man comes to the rescue, saves the woman, and his reward is the woman. Think about how that plays out in Vertigo. We won't get into Vertigo yet, but think about how that plays out. What else, guys?
We've literally turned that into a line. We've literally turned that into a line in film. Like, how they say, save the day, get the girl. Like, it's that is the encompass.
Yeah. Or, and the more similar thing which Hitchcock plays with in Vertigo as well is boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back, which in a rescue narrative, losing the girl sometimes is the girl's literally kidnapped or captive or in danger or, whatever. Yeah. In a romantic comedy, it's just the complications that ensue. What else, guys? What else about The Searchers? We got about 5 minutes. Well, let me mention a couple things. One is, I'm going to share the screen for a second, see if there's anything in this PowerPoint I want to remember to mention. One is just mentioning the idea that The Searchers is in fact based on a true story, in fact, based on quite a few true stories. The most... I think a couple of things to just consider. I meet a lot of students now who really don't even know who John Wayne is. But John Wayne is probably the biggest American star who ever lived. I can remember there was a survey taken of theater owners 5 years after John Wayne died, and they still voted him to be, even though he was making no more movies and he was dead, he was still voted to be, the top box office draw in America. And his character and his personality as it developed over the years, and the way in which that character was complicated. There's another John Wayne movie called Red River in which he plays a very sort of unsympathetic character like he does here. Eventually, John Wayne would start to kind of create his own series of movies. And he would really, I've used this word a lot today, but he would really codify this particular character through the 60s and 70s as he was controlling his own personality. He would start to play the same person. He would even wear the same wardrobe from one movie to another. So, the complexity in John Wayne in the 60s and 70s would be, he's got a beard, he's got an eye patch, it can be something almost that. So casting him in this part and playing him to some extent against the type, and you can see the type in Stagecoach, right? And we can see the playing against the type in The Searchers. And this idea of his racism being this large motivating factor, right, is a big complication for the way in which we view this movie. Because as Roger Ebert has talked about this a lot, are we looking at a movie that is telling us that this racism is bad? Or are we looking at a movie that is saying, yeah, we totally, we totally understand these people are savages and you should shoot their eyes out. And, we can't put ourselves necessarily in the eyes of someone who saw this film in 1956 in Nashville, Tennessee, right? And it may play again into this whole idea of, I think maybe different people in this movie are making different movies. His racism does lead him down this path of what we would today call an honor killing or a shame killing, which we see to some extent in some cultures in the Middle East. This incident, there was a woman by the name of Cynthia Ann Parker. And Cynthia Ann Parker was, in fact, by the way, if you want to finally convince yourself that human beings are the worst thing that has ever happened in the history of the universe, go find some descriptions and depictions of what happened during the Indian Wars in Texas in the 1830s through like the 1880s. On both sides, the most horrendous, horrible things being done to human beings you could possibly imagine. Some Comanches came in, they massacred a bunch of people at a place called Fort Parker, and they kidnapped several people, including Cynthia Ann Parker. Their uncle, again, went on this lengthy quest to try to find them. He was able to rescue some of them, but unable to rescue Cynthia Ann Parker. She was kidnapped at the age of 9. She was finally rescued at the age of 24. By the time she was rescued, she had basically been completely incorporated into Native American society to the extent that she didn't want to be rescued. And she had a very, very difficult time the last 10 years of her life, sort of trying to readjust. She would escape and have to be re-rescued again. So to some extent, she was kidnapped twice. A sort of complicated narrative that the Searchers deals with, but then ties a nice bow on the end of it and makes everything kind of happy by reincorporating everyone back into white society. There are other situations, with stories of children being kidnapped and of relatives going on these lengthy quests to try to rescue them. One's Britt Johnson, who was an African-American and a former slave. So there are lots of situations like this. This and the raid that the cavalry does on the Native American village. These are all things that are based on real historical events. The other thing I want to mention is, in this last 2 or 3 minutes, is Monument Valley. So Monument Valley, on the border, if I remember correctly, the border of Arizona and Utah, a big chunk of this is on Native American land. John Ford first put this on the screen, I think for the first time, I believe, certainly for the first important time, in Stagecoach in 1939. There was a rancher who owned some property nearby, and he did some tourism. He worked a lot with the Native Americans. He went to Hollywood with pictures of this place. He kind of went around the studios trying to convince people this was a great location. John Ford saw it and said, "Yeah, I want to shoot my Western there." And at that point, kind of became John Ford's location. Orson Welles talks about the idea that other people don't want to shoot at Monument Valley because they feel like it's copyrighted by John Ford, that he has his stamp on it. Nobody else should use it. It by the way, this is not what cattle country in Texas looks like. For one thing, what the hell are the cattle eating? This is a depiction of, this is a mythic area, right? This does not work on a realistic level. But it is so dramatic and so haunting that John Ford went back to this location again and again and again, developed a great relationship with the Native Americans there, employed them as crew members and extras, sort of kept the tourism aspect of that area, it kept it alive and active. And it's an incredibly important sort of visual in the history of cinema. So I think that, unless anybody's got anything else, I can keep talking for a few minutes, but that kind of ends the class officially. Let me throw it up one more time. I'm going to throw it back to Steve. Steve, do you have a concluding thought about The Searchers, something we didn't mention that came up in your class or that you think about?
Well, one thing that I like to point out, you mentioned, I think, the parallels between Ethan and Scar. But they really are mirror images of each other. You speak good English, somebody teach you. You speak good Comanche, somebody teach you.
Yeah.
Those kinds of direct parallels. But one of the most striking things to me is the ultimate stereotype of the hostile Native American is, of course, taking a scalp. We only see that happen one time in this film. There's only one character we see actually take a scalp. It's Ethan.
Yeah.
And one other thing about Monument Valley is true. Nobody wanted to shoot there because they would be accused of imitating Ford. There's only one filmmaker who ever had the nerve to actually make extensive use of Monument Valley, and that's Chuck Jones.
Yes, the great director of so many of the best Warner Brothers cartoons, the guy who created the Roadrunner. And
Yep.
I hadn't even thought of this in years. All the Roadrunner cartoons are all set in Monument Valley. That's absolutely true and absolutely wonderful. Let me conclude by saying, here's, I think I asked, I can't remember if it was Mac or Cam, I asked someone the question, why is this movie considered to be the greatest Western? And I will say, here's my opinion on why. It's the same reason that I think why people think Vertigo is the greatest movie ever made, why people think Citizen Kane is the greatest movie ever made. It is density. It is the fact that we have now talked about this movie for an hour and a half, and we barely scratched the surface of the things that we can look at, we can mention, we can notice, that even when the pieces don't work together, the pieces themselves are incredibly interesting, incredibly dense. There's lots of contradictory things. There's just lots to consider and talk about. We haven't even really talked much about the filmmaking to any great extent, the great compositions and the way things are shot, and the lighting, that in some cases in both of these films parallels stuff we see in Citizen Kane. Again, Orson Welles watched Stagecoach 40 times to prepare for shooting Citizen Kane. So when the villain stands up with his aces and eights in his hands and his face goes into the shadows because he's getting ready to be killed. The other thing, can I mention one more thing, guys? Okay, George Lucas. George Lucas, as we know, has a bizarre fixation on whether Han Solo shoots Greedo first, right? He has remade that scene at least 5 times. He has taken the scene where Han Solo shoots Greedo in the canteen, and he's changed it so that Greedo shoots and then Han shoots, and then he changed it to Greedo shoots and Han sort of ducks to the side in this weird cutout version, and then Han shoots. And he's recently changed it to where Greedo says McClunky and shoots. So one of the things George Lucas says is, I think I made a mistake in this original movie. I think Han is supposed to be eventually be a hero. Han's going to get the girl. Han is going to come back and rescue and save the day. Han should not shoot first. John Wayne didn't shoot first. The cowboy heroes don't shoot first. They let the other guy shoot first and then they shoot. I hope you notice that at the end of Stagecoach, the person who shoots first is John Wayne, because that character is not an idiot. He's going to wait for 3 other people to shoot at him before he fires. All right. So thank you, George. Got that one wrong, I'm afraid. Any last thoughts or comments? Any questions about the class? Anything we need to talk about? Or I have nowhere to go. I can just keep talking about stuff you guys want to.
Professor Bowen?
Yes.
Thanks for that email, by the way. I was going to say that next time I saw you.
Okay, good. I'm glad it was helpful.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we can call it quits then. Anybody else? All right. We will see you same time, same place, same meeting ID on Thursday. Steve, you want to hang around for a couple minutes? You got time? Okay. All right. We'll see you guys later.
Y'all have a good one.
Bye.
Hopefully everyone is well. So Steve, did we miss anything?
Oh, you have to miss. If you're only going to talk an hour, you have to. There's no way around it.
What was your class like when you did the searchers? You did that like last week, right?
Well, actually, it was a couple of weeks back. It was before the
Oh wow,
pandemic, because we did. Oh no, wait a minute. No, I'm thinking about Stagecoach. Yeah, we did searchers.
Oh,
yeah,
you did them
just
both. Okay, I didn't even know
a couple
that.
of weeks ago. Yeah. I love doing them both because the parallels are so. The thing I love about it is they're so similar, same genre, same star, same director, same, and yet they're so different.
Yeah.
I mean, these films are so.
Even just the black and white and the color thing. That the movies look so much different.
Yeah, and the polar opposites in Stagecoach, they're saved from the blessings of civilization, said sarcastically, and in the Searchers, it's not sarcastic. They really are saved from. I mean, it's Ethan who gets shut out, and that's a bad thing.
Yeah.
Ringo gets shut out, and that's a good thing.
Yeah.
He's being rescued. So I mean, it's just such a nice case study to be able to.
Yeah, because I used to just show the Searchers, and I would find myself always trying to reference back to Stagecoach and going, "Well, no one's seen it."
Right.
So,
exactly.
Yeah.
So just lay them both out and then talk about the differences. I love doing that. But yeah, there's so much there in the Searchers, and the Searchers is not going to spoon feed you anything.
Yeah.
It's gonna it's gonna bother you. It's gonna get under your skin, and all the things the students were talking about. They were bothered by this, bothered by that, and I'm sitting here thinking, good, you're supposed to be.
Yeah.
I would have a problem with you if you weren't bothered by anything in this film.
Yeah.
This is
And
supposed
because you're right, because even to the point of not really knowing. I think if you're watching this movie and you're our generation and you've seen it many, many years ago, that not knowing how you're supposed to feel about John Wayne. And if you're watching it without that baggage, not knowing how you're supposed to feel about Ethan, that gets really complicated. It really complicated.
There's so many layers to it, and not only is it, and you alluded to both of these, it's certainly a different film if you're if you're from a Native American culture, but it's also a different film depending on when you were born.
Yeah.
I mean, totally different film.
Yeah.
And how cool is that? How many films are there that have that many facets to them, and it depends on who you are. That's pretty cool, because you got a room full of people, and they're all seeing a different film. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Because a lot of films, no matter who sees it, it's the same film, and that's relatively boring.
Yeah, it is. It is really amazing how much stuff is really under the surface, and you've got to dig.
Mm-hmm.
One of my favorite things is I was looking at the Ethan comes home scene, and how Ethan is always standing up and his brother is always on the floor or in a chair. I mean, Ethan is just towering over this guy, and he seems so insignificant and so weak.
Yeah.
And it's just a visual. It's just, he's crawling under the bed to pull out this box, it's just, and Ethan's just standing there looking at him, with this tall
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
I love the shot where there's he and his brother are having a conversation, and the whole time Ethan is looking off to where Martha is.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
I mean, they're talking.
And the
The
brother
two of them.
doesn't even seem to get it. He doesn't even seem to notice it.
Yeah, I mean, he's
Yeah.
just not even I mean, body language wise, he's not even acknowledging that his brother is there, even while he's having a conversation
Yeah.
with him.
Yeah.
And the other shot I love is when Clayton is standing there, with his coffee cup, and man, he sees nothing. He
Yeah.
sees nothing.
Yeah.
He is just the only thing he cares about in this world is that cup of coffee.
Yeah.
He is absolutely not going to see anything.
Yeah.
And it's all going on right there,
I mean, yeah, literally like 2 feet from him. Yeah.
Yeah.
And he obviously knows it. There's obviously
Yeah.
a mystery here, and they're all in on it, except evidently the brother.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but I just love that shower, man. He's just he's so focused on that coffee and donut, man. It's
I'm
nothing
glad you
else
brought
going
up the
on.
scalping thing too, because I forgot to mention it, that really the whole scalping thing is a white guy thing.
Yeah.
That was really done by white people to Native Americans. They kind of picked up on it and started doing
Yeah.
it. But the stereotype that this is something Native Americans do is not true.
Yeah, that's the other layer to it, is that historical layer, that it's a made up stereotype to begin with.
Yeah. You ever seen Real Engine?
I remember as soon as you mentioned it, I remember having seen it, but it's been a while and I don't remember it very well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little uneven, but there's some really, really interesting clips in there and some really interesting perspectives.
Yeah.
If you're interested, I've got some clips up on my YouTube. Well, actually, they may be. I may have put them up unlisted, so you may not be able to see them. I mean, if there's anything you see that I'm using that you ever want, I'd still. What time is your class today?
Well, it's normally at 2:00. They don't have a live session today. They're just watching a pre-recorded lecture.
Oh, okay. Well, Kate is going back to Christie's tomorrow. And so Thursday, I'll probably have plenty of time to join you guys. What are you talking about on Thursday?
Oh, cool. That'll be great. This Thursday is Easy Rider.
Ooh, one I don't do.
Yeah. We're just getting into the 70s. So today they're supposed to be watching a pre-recorded lecture where I talk about Corman and, BBS and all that stuff, leading into, or actually Raybert, not BBS yet.
No.
And that's leading into them watching Easy Rider. So we'll be talking about Easy Rider on Thursday. And then next week will be Taxi Driver.
I know this sounds like the screwiest thing you've ever heard. And I know, especially coming from me or coming from anybody, I literally skipped the 70s.
Wow. Amazing.
Yeah. I go straight from The Graduate to Do the Right Thing. I've only got 15 movies. That's all I can do. So
well, that's true. Yeah, I mean, it's a different kind of course too. I mean, I'm doing a history course, so I mean, you can't.
Yeah. You're doing only half of the century. I'm trying to do the whole thing too.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
So that makes, because you're doing a film history course and you skip the 70s, you just lose your stripes right there.
I mean, if I could add one more movie, I'd add Godfather, but I don't add it because I think a lot of people have seen it.
I always tell them that if I could add one more, it would be 5 Easy Pieces.
Yeah.
The more I see that film, the more I love it, and the more important I think it is. And one of the things that I say about it is, Woody Allen has spent his whole career trying to make an American Bergman film, basically.
Yeah.
I think that Bob Rafelson did it with 5 Easy Pieces.
That's a really good take.
If Ingmar Bergman had been American, 5 Easy Pieces, I think, is the kind of film he would have made.
Really good take. I have to go back and watch that. I haven't seen that in years.
Oh man, every time I see it, I like it better. And see more in it. It's a hell of a thing.